Hello and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast. This is Jill Bodensteiner, Director of Athletics at St. Joseph's University. As leaders, it's really important that we're clear regarding our goals and our vision and how those integrate into the greater university goals. We also need to collectively create a strategy and a culture that are going to help us reach our goals. This is an evolving exercise that requires an openness to continuous improvement. That's why I follow the One Question Leadership Podcast, because I love learning as much as I possibly can from my colleagues that helps me be the best that I can be. So my message for the day, keep learning, keep leading.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at 1Q Leadership. We have two guests today, both at the same institution. We have Samantha Huckey. She is the Director of Athletics at William & Mary, and Coach Mike London. He's the head football coach also there at William & Mary. Thank you guys for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having me.
A little bit about your background. Samantha, you've been there since 2017. You've been in college athletics for roughly 20 years. You've been on a number of committees emphasizing diversity, inclusion, and equity, in addition to a number of NCAA committees and other influential committees in terms of college athletics and in terms of being on the campuses you've been on. You spent time at Texas A&M, Georgetown, Wake Forest, and a number of other institutions. And last I had you on the podcast, we talked about how you aren't afraid to make changes if they better the institution and the organization that you work for there at William & Mary. And Coach London, head football coach at William & Mary since 2019. Of course, you were the head coach at Howard University, University of Virginia, and won a national championship as the head coach at University of Richmond with 32 years in the coaching profession. After school, you graduated from the police academy and served as a detective for 2 years before getting into coaching, which is an interesting story in itself. And then the university you guys work at, it was the second university established in the United States, which is significant. And of course, if you were established at that time in the United States, much of how the organization was built and how the organization was functioned was based on the labor of slaves. Now, the school has owned up to its past and recognized and memorialized where it has come from and where it is and where it's trying to go. And I have a philosophy that says you already know who you are. So from this point forward, just focus on getting better. And I think that applies to individuals. I think that applies to institutions, organizations, groups, and even a country as a whole. And we see here what's happening outside. There's a lot of frustration amongst people of color. I guess I'll say it, there has never really been a trusting relationship between law enforcement and people of African American people in the United States. And that's going back to before the United States was established onto now. So from this point, you can either stay where you are or get better. I think I want to start this conversation with you, Samantha. Last time we talked, we focused on you have made a lot of changes, personnel changes and organizational culture changes at the university to help it enhance the academic mission of the university. And looking at what's going on in the country and in the world right now, I wonder how have those changes allowed for productive and effective discussions amongst the staff that you brought in, the staff that was there, and of course the student athletes?
Ty, that's a great question. And I don't know that any changes or structural building can really prepare one for contextually where we are as a nation. You know, first a pandemic that really shut everyone inside, frayed nerves, frayed emotions. You've got individuals who are very concerned about their own personal futures as well as collectively, whether it's through a corporation or in our case, a university, and what do the coming months bring? So that was a place we already were. And then you add to that what is a series of, and certainly not the first series of brutality against Black individuals, citizens of this country, by other citizens, vigilantes, as well as the police. You add that into the mix, and you have a contextualization that supersedes anything in athletics that we want to implement or want to do. What those changes that we have made, and the time since those changes have occurred, and that is our very intentional recruiting and hiring for coaches, staff, and administrators to truly begin to reflect the demographic and the way our students, their population is, and the students that we bring onto this campus. And what that, I believe, has allowed for is an even more open conversation between our own staff with each other, our student athletes to our staff. It has provided examples and modeling for our African American, Black, and Brown student athletes who are looking for someone with whom they can connect over these very shared experiences, of which I may be able to empathize, but I certainly don't have that experience as a white, a woman who by the very nature, just the virtue of my skin color, has a privilege because of that. And while I can open conversations and hold space, I can't say, I know how you feel, because there is no possible way. And so instead, what my role now is to provide that space, hold that space, and then be a voice using both that privilege that I have by the tone of my skin and my position in furthering that conversation, furthering action, making sure that we are having this really great talk around this. But my student athletes, coaches, and staff who have experienced this themselves for generations, but they individually have, but their ancestors have for generations. It is so critically important that they see me not only as an ally, but an advocate, right? An advocate for change, and someone who is willing to engage in those difficult conversations. And to your point about acknowledging where I'm wrong and acknowledging actually my lack of knowledge and appreciation for the fact that, I called Mike and I was like, hey, Mike, what do you think about this? And I learned that, wait a minute, don't ask my black head football coach how I should be addressing this when he at the very same time is feeling emotion around this himself. It is my duty to educate myself so that I can hold that space. And so I think having I'm really grateful, my senior leadership team, I've got 2 African American, one a woman and one a man, who have really been able to help us as a senior leadership team discuss this and be open with each other, and then also to set the model of leadership for our the rest of our department. So I think the changes that we made opened up more space to be able to have conversations based on the fact that there were relationships between our student athletes and our coaches and our staff that gave that comfort, for lack of a better term, to be able to engage in those conversations, if that's of any help.
Yes, ma'am, it is. Now, Coach London, Samantha, the reason why I'd like to have her on here or try to get her involved with what I do over at Athletic Director U is because I know she's not going to give us an athletic director answer, quote unquote, right? It's not a political answer.
I don't know if that's a good thing, Tony.
That could ever agree. Hey, she'll tell us the truth, right? And so obviously you are on, for the lack of a better, receiving end of everything she just said. So talk to me a little bit about that communication between the two of you, or just in terms of being a part of a staff and an organization with the history of William and Mary, with the acknowledgement that William and Mary has, and then, of course, some of the changes that Samantha has made. And, of course, last time we talked, Coach London, we talked about you having Samantha. She's a woman. She's an athletic director. The president is a woman. She's a president of a university. So there's an openness there in terms of not falling into the status quo of what we see around the country.
No, yes, it's critically important that there be a level of communication that that can speak to the highs, the lows, the frustrations, the exhilarations that occur in our sports, in what we do. And I think, and I believe in having an open conversation, an honest conversation with my athletic director, Samantha, is critical, because not only were we dealing with the COVID-19, we're one of the few teams that had a chance to finish up spring practice. And so we went into our player evaluations and make sure we checked their grades and monitored, how they were doing from that standpoint. So we had a little bit of football still to deal with the players once everyone found out about campuses were going to be closed and we had to deal with the sheltering in place. So there was a piece of what a student athlete at that time was still looking for, was something that they do that they can look at. There's tangible evidence of improvement or things that they've done. So as we were dealing with the challenges of that, and then again, as we all know, this incident, or not just George Floyd's incident. I mean, there was several instances in the last 45 days that occurred dealing with people of color, with Black people. And I remember a few days after George Floyd's killing, and it was just broadcast throughout not only the United States, throughout the world, that there was a level of anger, frustration, shock. What are we going to do, Coach? And so I had to find myself as an African-American head coach, father, husband, friend, son, all those things, particularly speak to the needs, the emotional needs at that point of our players. And it was tough. I mean, it was tough having that conversation. But the first thing I wanted to make sure was that for them to understand, them being at William & Mary, don't let anybody marginalize you, minimize you, cast you off to the side, try to put you in a box in terms of what your limitations are or will or can be. That they're at a place like William & Mary, at this place at this time, for a reason. And so we had to embrace the psychological part of it first, because they were, and rightfully so, really pissed off. And so in communication, you have to be open to being vulnerable too, Ty. I mean,
right.
I remember I called Samantha and she called me and we were talking, and just a welling up of personally having experienced the other end of racial epithets of the different places that I've been, experiencing them being marginalized and minimized. And I think I lost it on the phone with her, but the part of being willing and open and honest enough to communicate your feelings to someone else that doesn't look like you, but that's in a position, as she stated, to be an advocate. That's important, to share our experiences, as a player would share it to me, or as our players would share it to Samantha or President Rowe, but as a coach of color, to share it with those people that are in positions to affect change. And so I just think that it's critically important that players of color, African American coaches, men and women, that your dialogue be also heavily towards not only taking care of our young men and women, African American women, men and women, about the things that are going on, but also to people that can affect change with decisions, with demonstrative actions. And to tell you the truth, like I said, I have 5 African American coaches on my staff and 5 white coaches on my staff. So when we talk about inclusion and diversity, and they're all good men, and I love every one of them. And they're able to deal with our team in ways that they can bring their own perspective and perception and reality to what's going on. So and we all know it's still ongoing conversations. There's actions, there's demonstrative actions have been taken by the school, by William & Mary, as you mentioned. And it's an ongoing process that people are going to continue to keep looking to see the active change. And so I'm excited about, or I'm ready to. I've been in that position where the Tyrone Willinghams and the John Thompsons and the Tony Dungies were my role models growing up. And I want to be just like them. And I find myself fast forward now being a guy that other people are looking to. How are you going to respond, Coach? How are we going to act? What can we do? So I find myself also now allowing people to stand on my shoulders, which is which is what it's all about anyway.
Right, which is important. And I will say this to you, Samantha, and to you, Coach London. The changes you made over the last 2 or 3 years in terms of bringing a diverse staff, in terms of race, background, men and women, when the country goes through a situation like this, it makes for a better informed and engaged conversation when you do have those discussions. And that is something I think you've been involved in. I know at Texas A&M you were on a few committees there where part of your role was equity, inclusion, diversity, etc. So I know you probably understand the benefit of that, of having that diverse conversation. And then Coach London, if you lined up 100 Black men from ages 80 to ages 16, all of them with no crime, no criminal background, good citizens of the United States, probably 98 of them could probably say that they've had an interaction with the cops that was probably a negative interaction. And if they haven't, they know somebody close to them who has, brother, cousin, best friend, uncle, something like that. And that's been going on for multiple generations, for years and years and years. So the term "a few bad apples" has always bothered me, because if it's been a few bad apples for the last 400 and some years, and it goes across multiple generations, and then at some point with all those bad apples, you got to start looking at whether or not you have a bad apple tree. Coach, I wonder though, you being a former police officer, that balance between the necessity of law enforcement, but then also the responsibility of accountability in terms of being a cop and knowing that you are a necessity throughout every community. Have you had to address that background with your players throughout the years, even when you first got into coaching years ago, or now as a head coach in the last few stops?
Well, the players know when I first introduced myself, we talk about telling them your why. And being a police officer in the city of Richmond, a police detective, having a gun pulled on me, trigger pulled and not going off, is a significant life-changing event. But also being a police officer that had a chance to deal with the PAL, which is Police Athletic League, where you did activities, you coached young kids coming from underrepresented areas in the city of Richmond and surrounding, and have a chance to have a dialogue, have a chance to coach and teach, for them to see somebody outside of just a blue uniform. So that's critically important. I think the other thing is, obviously there is a need for society to be governed by rules and laws based on keeping order. I mean, all of us have values, and obviously human life is the top, one of the top values that are there, but that those values should be supported. We talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They should be supported, but for all people, not just some, for all people. So the conversations are always, or have been in the last few weeks, geared towards how can we make an effective change with that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness when you have all the things that are occurring, that have occurred over and over again. And as a coach, you get into coach speak sometimes, and I will, because of my experiences having been a police officer and a head coach, predominantly three white institutions, and being a head coach at Howard University, the HBCU, is to remain vigilant. It is to keep shining light on those things that are not right. I mean, the injustices, to hold myself accountable, as well as those that are in charge of me or have a chance to contribute to or have an influence with me or my well-being. I'm the same way with the players, and white, black, whatever colored players on our team. So it's a collective, collaborative effort. And I think one of the great things, what's going on now with Samantha and President Rowe, there's a deep recognizing and understanding of those things and demonstrative actions toward taking change. And it's going to have a ripple effect. You see, apparel companies, you see, NASCAR, you see all different kind of people that's like, you know what, I get it. And so hopefully it's a wake up call that says, hey, listen, you look at the coalition and the unity of people that are peacefully protesting. They're white, they're black. It's something that's it's truly remarkable to see. And the peaceful protesters I'm talking about, because my players have been involved in those protests. So it's instruments of change. And I work for a great athletic director and a president that are out in front leaders in this. And so we can have more people, businesses, institutions, changing ideology and things like that, then I think we're well on a way for demonstrative change.
Right. Samantha, speaking of you and the president, now every state in the nation has expressed some form of frustration regarding the way Black folks are treated in this country, which means that every student athlete, or staff member who is from the United States comes from a place where people are speaking up in support of that frustration. I wonder about the conversations on campus between you and the president or other leaders on the campus leaders in terms of moving forward with accountability and acknowledging. And I also wonder, I think what you find on colleges' campuses throughout the years is that a lot of times the students have great ideas in terms of how to move forward with things. So I wonder about that conversation on the general campus level.
One of the things I will say is I think my relationship with Coach London, one of the things from the start that we talked about, we wanted to be partners in this leadership. And I've really felt that it's a partnership between the two of us as we move a department and forward in student athletes. And that extends to our other coaches. And it's not just between me and the coaches. They have partnerships with each other. And, like Coach mentioned, we have student athletes who have organized incredible peaceful protests. And one of the things I've been most thrilled with is there's a protest every week in Williamsburg right off of campus. And each week I have seen members of our athletics department, coaches and staff and other student athletes who look more like me than the two of you, that are there in support, that are having conversations with people who come along and question the need for the protests. I think that's the kindest way I can say that. And I think you mentioned earlier that William and Mary has acknowledged our past, and we've acknowledged as an institution that this is an institution that was built by enslaved people, frankly, who were brought to these shores not more than 5 miles from William and Mary's campus. And our students are reminded each day when they walk this campus of that fact. And, I liken one of the things I've been saying when I've had conversations with people. I'm a third generation American. My ancestors chose to come to the United States. Mike's ancestors did not have that choice. And when we get to that basic understanding that, people are like, well, what are we doing now? And I wasn't a part of that. And you weren't. It doesn't matter. If you break it down to that basic fact that there is a generational blight on our society as a country, that we cannot change the past, we can acknowledge it, and we work towards changing the present and the future. And that's what our institution is committed to. And it's big and little ways, right? So it is literally having conversations with one-on-one, not only with student athletes who are particularly affected, but me having conversations with our donors who don't feel they are affected, and being able to have that conversation and humanize the movement, right? And to be able to say, this is why we need to do it differently this time. And, my president is so good at this, and is out in front and is taking action and is listening prior to taking that action to many constituencies to ensure that we truly give a voice to these changes. And it's not a top-down change. What our job is to support and advocate on behalf of the change that needs to occur with our privilege and position.
So, Coach London, I've talked to some Black coaches, and I've had other people who talked to some coaches, and they don't necessarily know how to. Some of them are wondering, how do we talk to our head coach who may be white? Or how do we talk to some of our assistants about this? They come asking me questions or don't understand. And sometimes it's like, well, you could have asked this question 2 years ago. Why are you asking now? So I just wonder, Coach London, how are you advising the assistant coaches you have or the people that you've influenced throughout your career if they are asking you about advice on navigating conversations and dealing with what's going on now?
We have to understand it and recognize that it's a situation that's been occurring, that's occurred over and over and over again. And since COVID and other things have gone on, I've been reading a tremendous amount of books and leadership training seminars and all those things. But what I found something interesting, which talks about kind of the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and one is absence of trust. So already there's an absence of trust between young Black, students, athletes, citizens, and law enforcement. The fear of conflict. You have to have critical conversations. You have to have the conversations that are going to, again, I'll say this. My grandfather used to say, I felt sorry for myself because I had no shoes till I met a man that had no feet. So you're going to have to put yourself in perceptions, perspectives, and the realities of the other person that you're dealing with. The other thing is people want to see commitment, because the other thing is a lack of commitment. Things happen. Oh yeah, that's bad. But then you don't see any commitment. So that's another. And then avoiding any measures of accountability, about saying, hey, listen, I can make a difference. I can be accountable for how the circle of influence that I have within my team, my department, fan base, my family, whatever it is, that circle of influence that you have to hold yourself accountable. If you're talking about you want to see change, be a demonstrated agent of change for that. And then, then look for results, as things go, things happen. I know this might be a process, but at the same time, seeing things and signs and indications and commitments of people wanting to make a difference by their actions. And it boils into that. So the biggest thing, Ty, is being relational with an individual. We get away with sometimes at asking, hey, Ty, how you feeling? And then you may say, I'm feeling all right. And then we may move on because you said you're feeling all right. So that's okay. And that's what happens. Or, hey, Ty, how has this thing affected you? Give me some ways that it's affected you personally, emotionally. Engage in the conversation and the questions that's going to get you or have to get you to respond back in a way that then you'll have some feedback. Because if I just asked you how you're doing and you said okay, then I move on about my merry little business. And then later on, it's like, well, I asked him if he was doing okay. He said he was doing all right. No. So, but I think that's part of it, being relational. Know there's already a level of mistrust. Know that you're going to have that critical conversation because there's a fear of conflict. Know that they're going to see some sort of commitment from you in terms of what you said or what you appear to be saying that, is what's going to happen. Don't avoid accountability, be accountable for the circle of influence that you can control, and then that will spread throughout, to others. And then the last thing is just, look for results as it starts to go forward. So I would say those things, and I've had a lot of conversations. My Dane Fisher, our basketball coach, phenomenal, man. He's phenomenal. He has taken our team to the African American Museum up in Washington, D.C., and that's a way to engage and solicit dialogue and people understanding where you came from, what your history is all about. So, doing things like that, I think, are critical.
Right. Excellent. Well, I'll ask this last question to both of you before you wrap. And you guys have touched on it throughout. You try to find a positive lining in everything that's happening. What makes you excited about the conversations that are happening now and the potential for positivity that we see specifically for you guys on campus there at William & Mary?
Yeah, I would say that they're not one-sided anymore. We're not telling our student athletes what we're going to do for them, but we're listening to them. And that's from student athlete to administrators and coaches. But then also, like Coach just alluded, it is a two-way conversation, where I'm able to say to Coach, and I never thought about it that way, thank you for enlightening me. How else can I be a support to you? And so, and I also think you touched on this earlier. I think demonstrations and responses in the past have been largely by the affected communities, by the Black community, by the African American community. And what you're seeing now is, yes, there are still individuals who are Black, Brown, African American who are marching, but you're seeing people who look more like me walking alongside them, vocalizing the same concerns. And to me, that gives me hope. It really does. We got a long way to go, but it gives me hope.
I would say, like as I said before, initially the shock, dismay, the anger, the frustration, then it started to turn into, all right, we want remedy, we want justice. All right, we're raising awareness. As you look at this new generation Z, as you look around, you see worldwide, you see throughout this country, all races and nationalities were peacefully protesting, and there's outside added few that are burning businesses down and things like that. I mean, if you're a business owner in your own town, you're not going to burn your business down, but that the media pays a lot of attention to that. But I think this new generation Z is calling for action through demonstrated engagement, through their protests, through the demands of, all right, what are your practices and your procedures on our institutions, on our law enforcement? Dr. Virginia Wells at William & Mary brought up a great point about asking local law enforcement, or those law enforcement that touch your community, what's your use of policy? What is your use of policy standards? What meets the criteria of using lethal force? And so, educating ourselves on the policies and procedures of the people that govern us is going to be critically important. But I see this new generation, smart generation. I know people say they might be lazy, but I tell you what, they're smart. The social media, things you can capture by phone, they're not sitting around. They're doers, and it's great to see that occur from not only standpoint of just what's going on with us, but coaches that I call, other coaches in the ACC, and some of the HBCU schools that I coached. It's amazing how this thing is kind of galvanized all students, all people of color, and trickled up instead of trickled down as it usually does.
All right, which is an excellent thing. Well, Samantha, Coach London, this has been an excellent conversation. I'm sure most of the things you guys doing at William & Mary, if people are interested, can be found on the website, or they will see over the next few months as you guys implement the things you guys are doing there on campus. This has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate you guys joining us here on One Question.
Yeah, thanks, Ty. It was great.
Thanks for having me, Ty.
That was Coach Mike London. He's the head football coach at William & Mary, and Samantha Hughey. She's the director of athletics at William & Mary also. And of course, this is Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.